So as I mentioned last Sunday, I was going to devote two homilies to the notion of naming. So the emphasis last week was on naming among humans, initiation rites. And today the emphasis will be on names of God, names of creation, and names of incarnation. So I've chosen a reading from the book of Exodus from chapter 3, a few selections from it, in which God reveals one of his names. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it didn't burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange thing, why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he'd gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground. He went on to say, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. God said, so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you would say to the Israelites. I am sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Words inspired by God. If I were to give this homily a name or a title, I'd call it probably Who in God's Name is God? So let me begin with a kind of an introduction, a story. Judaism was not a monotheistic religion until very, very, very late on. In fact, until about the year 550 BCE. And it became monotheistic under the influence of the great religion called Zoroastrianism during a period of time from 589 BCE to 539 BCE, when the last two tribes of Israel were in exile in Babylon. And they came under the influence of Zoroastrianism, which had reduced the pantheon of gods down to two gods, Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and Ahriman, the god of darkness. And then they took it from there and went the next step. But it didn't certainly start out as a monotheistic system. So if you believe in the existence of Abraham, who allegedly would have lived about 1850 BCE, Abraham certainly wasn't monotheistic. Some God whom he didn't know chose him and said, I'm going to be your God and I'm going to give you a promised land. Moses, who came 600 years after Abraham, about the year 1250 BC, certainly wasn't monotheistic. And when Moses gave us the 12 commandments, the first of them shows that Moses was not a monotheist. The first one says, first, I am the Lord your God. You're not allowed to have other gods in front of me. It didn't say false gods. It said other gods are foreign gods. So this God is acknowledging there's lots of gods, but I'm your guy. So you got to follow me. So even at the time of Elijah, who flourished about 800 BCE, they're still not monotheists. So they practice what's called monolatry. Monolatry is very different from monotheism. Monotheism is the belief system that there is only a single God. Monolatry is the realization there are many gods out there, but I'm going to choose this guy and I'm going to make a covenant with this guy. That's called monolatry. So Judaism was a practice monolatry for a long, long period of time, until about 550 BCE. So even at the time of Elijah, 800 BCE, they're still not monotheistic. Which brings me to the point I want to make about how did Elijah get his name? Because that'll introduce the idea of naming. So here's the kind of the backstory to Elijah's name. So allegedly God calls Abraham about 1850 BC and promises him to give him a land flowing with milk and honey. And he comes into the land of Canaan and he finds out there's constant famine and drought in the land. So on 2 occasions, Abraham and Sarah have to go down to Egypt to get food because there's no food in the promised land for them. And eventually his grandson, Jacob, has to emigrate with his entire family down to Egypt because there's no food in the land flowing with milk and honey. And they're enslaved allegedly for 430 years. And there's no sign of this God. This God who promised Abraham to give him a land flowing with milk and honey, there's no sign of him. And they're gone from the land. And now they're subsisting in Egypt. And then all of a sudden, God shows up at the burning bush, the story we've just learned, after a 430-year absence, a kind of a deadbeat dad who certainly reappears. And he tells Moses, I want you to go into Egypt and I want you to set my people free. The people whom I haven't had anything to do with for 430 years, the people whom I've abandoned for 430 years. Now, Moses is actually wanted in Egypt for murder. He had murdered an Egyptian and he had to flee. And he married a woman called Zipporah, who was the daughter of a guy called Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. And here he is now, a kind of a shepherd looking after his father-in-law's flocks, when he sees this sign of a burning bush. And he comes over to see what it is, and you've heard the story. And God says from the burning bush, put off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And then he says, I want you to go back into Egypt, where you're wanted for murder, and set my people, go to the Pharaoh and tell him, I want to set my people free. And Moses says, are you joking me? Who am I to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go? I don't even know who you are. If I do go back and I say to them, I've come to set you free, and they say, what God told you that? What am I going to say to them? What's your name? And then God says in Hebrew, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, which is always mistranslated as I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a linguistic device called predication without a verb. What God actually said in Hebrew was, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, I will be who I will be. In other words, whatever the situation demands, that's who I will be. So go back now and tell the people, the name Yahweh is, I am who I am, I will be who I will be. Go back and tell them that that's my name forever, and I want to set you free. Now, so the Exodus happens. They spend 40 years wandering in the desert. Then they come into the promised land. They spend 200 years conquering it. They arrive in the promised land about the year 1210 BCE. They spend 200 years conquering it. And finally, Jerusalem falls in the year 1010 BC under David. And now David becomes the king of the 12 tribes. But for the next 200 years, there's constant drought and famine in the country, in the land flowing with milk and honey. So at this stage, the people are getting fed up. They've been 400 years now in the land, and there's constant drought and famine and lack of rain. And so they begin to think, maybe it's time we made a covenant with a different God. This God, Yahweh, seems to be really good militarily. He's a great, general, a battle general. He doesn't know diddly squat about agriculture or about rain. Maybe we need to follow a different God. What about the God Baal? He seems to be into agriculture and rain in a big way. So there's this huge division, and there are people wanting now to follow a new God. And at this stage, this prophet arrives, and he says, you can follow whoever you want, but I tell you who I'm following. And then he gives himself a nickname. He says, I am Eliyahu. Now, Eli, from the word God, is El, L-E. E means my, L-E means my God. Yahu, Eliyahu, my God is Yahweh. You can follow whoever you want, but my God is Yahweh. And it's interesting, that's exactly the phrase that Jesus uses when he's dying on the cross. In Mark's gospel, where he calls out in agony, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? And the people thought, oh, he's calling on Elijah. But he wasn't. He was saying, my God, Eli, my God. And so Elijah is a name that was given by Elijah to himself. It's a nickname that made up to demonstrate what his mission was, to follow this particular God and to try to bring the people back into alignment with this God. So that's by way of introduction to what I want to say this morning. So basically, I want to make 3 main points. The first one will be naming God. Secondly will be naming creation. And then thirdly, naming incarnation. So that's where I go this morning. The difficulty about reading the scriptures or any scriptures in any language which is not the one in which was written, that you don't get the full value for the meaning. So when you read through the Hebrew scriptures and you come across God said this or God said that or God did the other, you don't realize that the word that's translated as God into English comes from several different words in Hebrew. And so scattered throughout the Hebrew scriptures are totally different names for God. And I just mentioned 7 of them. Sometimes God is just called El. And El, in fact, was the main Canaanite god. He was the god of creation and their chief deity. So the word El, in many configurations, is used frequently to describe God. So sometimes it's just El, E-L. Sometimes it's a version called Elyon. Sometimes God is called Elyon. Sometimes God is called El Shaddai. And so sometimes God is called Elohim. So there are many variations of this word El. And so if you're not reading it in the original Hebrew, you don't know actually which of these names is being used. Now, very, very often when devout Jews are reading the scripture, are talking about God in the synagogue, whenever they come across a word for God in the Hebrew text, they say Adonai. They don't read the word that's there. They're not going to say El or Elyon or El Shaddai or Yahweh or Elohim. They won't say that out of respect. So they'll use the word Adonai, which literally means the Lord. But when they come out of the synagogue and they're having secular discussions, they won't even say Adonai. They will say Hashem. And Hashem literally means the name. So they won't even say what the name is. They'll just call him the name. It's like, you know who I'm talking about, you know, your man. So what they won't even give him a name. And so even when they write it in English, if you see a Hebrew scholar writing about God in English, he'll write it as G-D. He won't put in a vowel. So he doesn't even want to say the word God. So he'll say G-D. So when you're reading through the Hebrew scriptures, if you're not reading it in the original, you have no sense of how many different names are being used for God and just translated as God in the kind of the English version. So I want to focus on 2 of them particularly, the name Yahweh and the name Elohim. Now, Elohim appears 2,500 times in the Hebrew scriptures, but its meanings are all over the place. Sometimes when you come across the word Elohim in the scriptures, it means gods in general, like they talk about the Elohim of Egypt, the gods of Egypt. Sometimes when they use it, it is Yahweh, who is the Elohim of Israel. Sometimes they're talking about the seraphim. When the word Elohim is used, they're talking about the seraphim. Sometimes they're talking about the spirits of the dead when they use the word Elohim. When you come across the phrase B'nai Elohim, the sons of God in the scriptures, it's talking about a kind of a divine council, that God has counselors. And this is borrowed from the Sumerian notion, the Anunnaki, you know, with Enki and Enlil, who are the sons of, you know, the God, and a kind of a council of gods. Now, Elohim then is the very first name given to God in the Hebrew scriptures. In the first book, in the first chapter of the first verse, we read that Elohim created, that Elohim was the source of all that is. And so in this sense then, the very first name of God that we mention is Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created. That's how Genesis chapter 1 starts out. And then the story I just read for you in Exodus, the second book of the scriptures, in chapter 3, verse 14, it starts off in the Hebrew saying, Elohim called out of the bush. Where we read God called or the Lord called, the word that's actually used is Elohim called him out of the midst of the bush and said to Moses, put off your shoes. And then in the middle of that, he changes his name to Yahweh. So it starts off, the story starts off with God being called Elohim, and then it winds up with God being called Yahweh. So I want to focus on these 2 names for a few minutes then. These are the 2 which are most frequently used. As I said, Elohim is used 2,500 times in the Hebrew scriptures. And the other name Yahweh is used actually 7,000 times in the Hebrew scriptures. So where do these come from? So a group of great German scholars in the 1800s determined that the 5 first books of the Hebrew scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were actually the work of 4 totally different traditions. They certainly were not written by Moses. They weren't written by a single scholar. They were written over a period of hundreds of years by many, many, many different authors, and they're put together and edited in various fashions. But in particular, I want to talk about two parts of it. So there's a section called J for Yahweh, a section called E for Elohim, a section called D for Deuteronomy, and a section called P for the priestly caste. So there are 4 different kinds of writings got amalgamated into the Tanakh, into the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the first 5 books. So let me give you a little bit of background to this. And the first thing to realize is that, they talk about J meaning Yahweh, because these were German scholars, and in German, J is pronounced like a Y. And so, for instance, our good friend, Jonathan, his name is spelled with a J, but it's pronounced Jonathan. When we talk about Jerusalem written with a J, in Hebrew, it's called Yerushalayim. When we talk about Jesus written with a J, his name in Hebrew is Yeshua. And so where you see a J, you have to put in a Y. There's not a J in Hebrew, there's a Y in Hebrew. And so the name Yahweh is often written, it's called the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, Yud, He, Vav, He. And then you get the name Yahweh as a possible, transliteration of that. But here's the background to these 2 traditions. For 200 years, from about 1210 BCE to 1010 BCE, the Israelites are conquering the land of Canaan. Finally, in the year 1010 BC, they captured Jerusalem, and now David is a king ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. David died around the year 970 BC, and then his son Solomon takes over, and Solomon is ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. But Solomon died in the year 933 BC, and there was civil war in the country, and the country split into 2. So the southern kingdom is called Judah. It's in the south, and it consists of just 2 tribes. And it has the temple. The temple had already been built by Solomon. So it has a temple, has a priesthood, has a king, and the center of it is Yerushalayim and the temple in Jerusalem. And about the year 950 BCE, they had begun writing their own scriptural tradition. And in this scriptural tradition, God is known as Yahweh. And that's what we get J from. That's the J tradition, the tradition in which they call God Yahweh. The rest of the kingdom, the 10 tribes in the north, seceded, and they don't have a temple, they don't have priests, and there's constant assassinations going on. Of the 19 next kings, about 10 of them are actually assassinated by people who take over from them. So there's no continuity of kingship, and they have no temple. And so who's holding it together for them are the prophets, not the priests, not the temple, not the king, but the prophets. And they begin writing their own scriptural tradition about the year 750 BC, so about 200 years after the southern kingdom had begun writing it. And in this scriptural tradition, God is called Elohim, or E. So now you've got the 2, you've got a J representing Judah and the southern kingdom, which God is called Yahweh, and then the northern kingdom, which God is called Elohim and is called E. Now, in the year 722 BCE, the northern kingdom is overthrown by the greatest Syrian empire, and the 10 northern tribes are taken into exile, and they vanish, and they are never heard of again. But a few scholars escape from the north, and they bring their sacred scriptures down to the south with them. And now the scholars get together, the Yahwistic scholars and the Elohim scholars, and they try to merge these 2 traditions. But it's very, very poorly edited. So very often they put stories side by side that contradict each other. So in the very, very first chapter, the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis, there are 2 totally different accounts of creation. In chapter 1, God is called Elohim, and creation proceeds in a particular fashion. In chapter 2, God is called Yahweh, and there's a totally different account of creation. The same thing happens when you talk about the flood. There's the E tradition of the flood and the J tradition, and they're completely different, totally different accounts, how long it lasted, where the rains came from, etc. And so we have to realize then that when we're talking about the names of God, you have all these possibilities together. So if you're reading it in English, you have no idea really what the original is saying. Are they talking about El? Are they talking about Elyon? Is it saying El Shaddai? Is it saying Adonai? Is it saying Yahweh? Is it saying Elohim? And so if you read it in the original, you get a totally different sense of who God is, what his names are, and what his function is. So that's the first piece. I want to talk about naming God. From there, I want to go then about naming creation. So there's a great story then in the very beginning of Genesis where God has created Adam and Eve, whether it's the first version or the second version, and he's created all of the other animals. And now he gives them the opportunity for naming the animals. Now, again, coming from a kind of Western mindset, we have no appreciation of what that means, to name the animals. It's not God is saying to them, oh yeah, see that guy over there with the kind of the long nose? What do you want to call him? And you think, Michael? Butter? Grass? No. Oh, let's call him an elephant. And then you go animal to animal and you start giving names. That's not what happened whatsoever. What it means in the Hebrew is to know somebody's name is to be in relationship with that being. And in some senses, to have some kind of responsibility for that being. And so what they're being invited to do is be in a relationship with nature, be in a relationship with all sentient beings. And giving them a name means recognizing and acknowledging their essence. Now, the problem is, when you acknowledge and recognize the essence of something, it gives you a measure of control over them. And that's why God refuses to divulge his name. That's why he says, not I am who I am, but I will be who I will be. It's none of your business to know my name. I'll be whatever the situation demands of me. And so Adam and Eve are being invited to be in relationship with the world in which they find themselves, to have responsibility for it, to be stewards of creation. You get the very same notion in the Aboriginal stories of Australia. According to the Aboriginal stories, all of creation was sung into being by the ancestors. Every mountain, every river, every blade of grass, every tree was sung into being. Its very essence came into being as a result of the music and the stories and the songs of the ancestors. And in order to kind of traverse terrain of any kind, to climb any mountain, to forge any stream, to pluck fruit from a tree, you needed to know the music of the tree or the mountain or the stream. You needed to know what created it. You needed to be in resonance with the essence of it. Now, we get a little bit of the same notion in science properly understood. When you look at the fact that, I've said many times that we know now that all of matter is frozen light, that basically every single thing that you can feel solid, it is frozen light. So matter and material, what does it come from? It comes from the word in Latin, mater, which means mother, or in English, mother, or in Gaelic, we say mohir. So you got this extraordinary sound that seems to bring into being the very stuff, which we're relationship with. So matter itself comes into being because it's frozen light. And it is the mother in some senses. And many languages pick up this word, material, matter in Latin, mother in English, moher in Gaelic. So sound and logos then becomes that which gives shape or form to matter. So logos is responsible for morphology, for the ways in which all of matter exists in a myriad of different forms. So the light creates the matter and the sound of the logos creates the form of the matter. And so we're told in the beginning of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was Logos, in the beginning was the sound, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him came into being nothing that came into being. And so it is sound of some kind, it is frequency of some kind that calls matter into its particular forms, whether it's going to be an elephant or an oak tree or a human being or a daffodil. Now that becomes really very important then when we begin naming nature or naming anything, because a name is a frequency, it's a vibration, it's an energy form, it's a conductor of information, and it actually is part of our DNA. It's what forms our DNA into particular kinds of configurations. So I've said to you before that we know that there's more information beamed onto planet Earth in 5 minutes of sunlight than is contained in all of the archives and libraries on planet Earth every 5 minutes. And I made the contention that the primary mover of evolution in our planet, is light. And I would add to that today, it is light and sound. It is sunlight and sound that drive evolution on our planet. It is not random mutation. It's not just selection of the fittest. There are secondary considerations. It is light and it is logos that both create, give form, and then evolve stuff. So we have to be really, really aware of the fact that we're living in a vibratory universe We're living in a universe of logos, a universe of sound and frequency and vibration. And we ourselves, are musical instruments. And I say something about that in my third point. So I kind of call this naming incarnation. I have the vision one time, a long, long time ago, that the last thing that Grandmother God does before she lets souls parachute into incarnation is to whisper two things to each soul. The first one is your secret, sacred name. The vibration that's at the core of your soul. Not just a tag that they're going to hang on you during your baptism, but your secret, sacred name. That's the first thing she whispers to us. And the second thing is, remember what you're going down there to do. Remember you volunteered? I didn't push you. You volunteered. You said, here I am, Lord, send me. And I'm sending you. And you're on a mission. And your mission is where you were incarnated to wake up to the fact that you have a body, but you're not your body. That you have emotions, but you're not your emotions. That you have an intellect, but you're not your intelligence. That you have a personality, but you're not even your personality. You're a bite-sized piece of me. You're a fractal of me. You're a hologram of me. And your job is to wake up other people to that realization. And finally, to wake up the very planet itself so it can move into a kind of a Christ consciousness. So there's your name and there's your mission. There are the last two things that Grandmother God says to us as we come in. And I've been long fascinated with having the opportunity of learning several different languages to look at how certain kinds of sounds aggregate and constellate and join together. And I'm fascinated at the kind of the connection between the name and the soul. So I'll give you a few examples. In Latin, the word for name is nomen, and the word for a soul is anima. So you're going to get M-N sounds appearing again and again here. In Gaelic, the word for a name is anim, spelled A-I-N-M, and the word for a soul is onam, A-N-A-M. And so name and soul are very, very almost identical, like nomen and anima. So wherever you're going to get the words, an N and an M in any language, there's a special frequency, there's a special resonance. So even the word name, you got an N and an M there. The word amen has an M and an M there. The word om has got this M sound. The word numen or numinosity, a kind of the special transcendent quality, has an N and an M. So these are special sounds that when you pronounce them, when they come into words, when you understand what you're saying, you're actually in relationship with the soul of that which is. So I had this extraordinary vision a few weeks ago, sitting in my meditation room, and I have a little Tibetan bell. It's like a bowl, and you have a kind of a stick that you move around the inside, and the bowl begins to sing. And different size bowls of different materials will sing differently. This one I have is kind of a brass bowl. So it's called a singing bowl. And I came to the realization that the womb, a mammal's womb, a mother's womb, is actually a singing bowl. That's exactly what it is. The womb in which you were born creates the perfect frequency to welcome the embryo and to nourish the embryo in utero. It's not just a kind of a physical location, that you're growing, another human being. The womb is a musical instrument that's actually creating the ideal frequency and the ideal sound to conceive, to carry the baby. And there are many musicians involved in this process. It's not just the mother. The mother is a very important musician in this process, but there are other musicians involved with the conception and the carrying of a child. Grandmother God is a musician that's orchestrated this. The mother obviously is. The father is. Family members are. Angels who are in attendance upon conception and carrying are also musicians. Mentors, those angelic beings who prepared you for incarnation, they're musicians attendant upon this. So you're going to get a plethora of these musicians present at conception, at birth, and at death. These are the three great, singing bowls of incarnation. And all of these musicians are present. God herself is present. The mother is present. The father is present. The family is present. The culture is present. The angelic host is present. The mentor figures are present. And they're there when you're conceived. They're there when you're being born, and they're there when you transition into the next phase. So we have to be really, really careful about the music that we create to raise our babies in, because as individuals, as families, and as cultures, we can create cacophony or we can create symphony. So we can welcome our babies into a cacophonous culture or into a symphony of sound, depending upon how we create the environment into which they come, as individual family members, as cultures, and as a world community. So the music either forms or deforms the evolution of incarnation. And that's true of the individual embryo, and it is true of the species itself. The music we create through our thoughts, through our words, and through our actions are the singing bowl. They're in the womb in which reality is being conceived and birthed and transitioning. So we have to be really, really careful when you're giving a name to anything, or you're calling on a name, or you're referring to somebody, whether it's a person or a place or an event. You have to be really, really careful about the words you're using and the thoughts that are, creating the words that you're going to use. Because as you articulate and as you vocalize and as you verbalize, you're calling into being a specific version of reality. You have to be really mindful. I believe that words are the acoustical version of the observer effect of quantum mechanics. We know from quantum mechanics that it's the observer that collapses the wave function of all possibilities down to the specific outcome of a photon of light. It's the observer effect. It's the observer that collapses all of the possibilities down to what actually transpires. And the acoustical version of that is the words that you're using. You have to be really, really aware of the fact that your words become flesh. This did not just happen in John's gospel, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word, everything was created through the Word, and without the Word was nothing created. There is nothing created in the world in which you live, which is not being created by the words that you're speaking. Be careful.